What was probably opening a can of worms I may not want to hear, but what is anything you don't want to talk about?
That's all right. Go ahead.
But what's been your strangest experience between the writing and the poetry scene? I mean, as far as the poetry scene, as far as anything like that, what's the strangest thing that ever happened to you?
I don't know. I guess it was probably Illuminati Lady. I wrote a poem called Illuminati Lady. I don't have a copy of it any longer. I wish I did. It's mentioned in the Illuminatus trilogy as a poem you really ought to read. And it was intended as a poem of infinite length, which I never completed. And one section of Illuminati Lady was called The Secret Teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. And in there, just to prove that anything could be proven with quotations and citing references and books and so on and so forth, I decided that I was going to demonstrate in this poem that Mahatma Gandhi had committed suicide, that he had plotted his own assassination. And in the process of researching that premise, which I adopted to begin with because I thought it was ridiculous, I convinced myself that he did in fact plan his own assassination, and to this day I think he committed suicide. I think he sat down with Savarkar, who was the leader of the violent faction in Indian politics, and planned his own suicide. And Savarkar has often been accused of being behind Gandhi's assassination. And I think he did it because of the extreme fighting that was going on at that time between Hindus and Muslims. And it was his way of trying to bring people back to their senses. There's enormous evidence for it. He predicted his own assassination. The night before he talked about it. That morning he talked about it. He predicted the method by which he was going to be assassinated, and he even predicted the words that he had, the last words that would be on his lips. Ram, Ram, Hai Ram. So, just basically God, God, oh God. But that was it was that weird. And he was also involved with Madame Blavatsky, which is very interesting. He said he wasn't fit to touch the hem of her dress. He thought she was a great mystic, a great person. And of course Madame Blavatsky's been accused of being involved with the Illuminati and with Freemasonry and this, that, and the other thing. So there's a lot of really weird tie-ins in Gandhi's life. Another thing I found in the process of those researches that I touched on in the poem was that his most ordinary statements were often regarded as parables, and people were always finding cryptic meanings in the things that he said. So that was by far the weirdest experience that ever happened to me. I also heard a rumor that Meyer Lansky read that poem and liked it enormously. I don't know if that's true or not. I like to think that it was.
Why? I'm not familiar with the name. Who is he and why would
he was the richest gangster in the United States. He was with Bugsy Siegel and Al Capone and so forth in the early days, and wound up owning the Miami National Bank, and was by far was one of the richest human beings in the United States, and was certainly the most successful organized crime figure in America, for whatever that's worth.
Okay, is there anything you want to talk about?
I don't know. The only thing that I'm thinking much about these days is the relationship between Zen and anarchism. There's a saying in Japan that Zen is poetry and poetry is Zen. So I guess that in that sense it's something to do with poetry. I don't consider myself enlightened, and I'm by no means a Zen master or a Zen teacher. In fact, all my knowledge of Zen is based upon reading. The Zen masters say that's like reading prescriptions and saying, what great medicine, and never taking any of the medicine yourself. I've read, I'm sure, well over 100 books on Zen, because the way they express themselves, the way Zen masters express themselves, fascinates me. their choices of words. It's very poetic in a very strange way, because as the author of the Blue Cliff Record says, they say things that even clamps cannot get a hold of. That there's just things that just it reminds me of something that Greg Hill used to do. The phone would ring and he'd pick it up and he'd say, "Wrong number, please." And he'd say, "I like that because there's no way you can make any sense out of it, no matter how hard you think about it. And yet it sounds like it should make sense, you know." And the other thing about that is that that type of stuff sticks in your mind. My friend Vic Latham was a French Quarter poet and a writer of short stories, and very good short stories. And he used to keep a little notebook called Hang-Ups, and this was when Hang-Ups was a hip term back then, but it didn't refer to kinks or quirks. It meant something that if it hangs your mind up, it's a hang-up, you know. And so it was things like the people we think are inferior, we discriminate against the people we know are inferior, such as retarded children and so on and so forth. We treat with great care and courtesy and build homes for them and everything else. That's a hang-up. One time the Zen master Nansen said to his disciple Joshu, he says, "I think sometimes we should be more like the animals." And Joshu said, "What do you mean by that?" And Nansen got down on all fours, and Joshu trampled him, and then ran and hid in the Zen meditation center behind a statue of the Buddha, probably. Anyway, an attendant came in who was sent by Nansen and asked him to come back. He wouldn't. He just cowered behind the statue of the Buddha and said, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And so the attendant went back and told Nansen that, and Nansen was a little puzzled. He understood the trampling. He didn't understand the need for repentance, though. And so he sent the attendant back to say, "Well, what are you sorry about?" And he says, "I'm sorry I didn't trample him twice over." That's a hang-up, you know. Especially when it's supposed to be a religious parable. It's a real hang-up, man.
Tell me about your book, Zenarchy.
Well, Zenarchy, the ultimate project of Zenarchy, which I didn't happen to reveal in the book Zenarchy, is to find some way to wake everybody up. They've done a lot of experiments, and not necessarily in the Zen sense. They've done a lot of experiments with obedience performance and obedience perception at Ivy League colleges in the United States. The original idea was that they were going to compare Americans and Germans to try to figure out why Germans were so obedient. In the experiments, the Americans turned out to be so obedient that they never bothered to go to Germany. They would tell people, for example, there would be a doctor in a white coat who would tell somebody to pull a lever, and that they thought that when they pulled the lever, the subject of the experiment thought when he pulled the lever it was going to electrocute some guy behind a wall of glass in the next room. And 80% of the people would pull the lever without asking any questions. Even though they didn't know what the doctor's position was, they didn't even know what his name was or anything else. He was just a man in a white coat who was telling them that and it said on the lever, "Danger, high voltage," so on and so forth. And the guy in the other room would be, "Ah!" in the chair like that, you know. And they'd just keep on pulling the lever. And another thing they did was drawing lines on blackboards, and there would be a whole classroom full of people who were in on the experiment except for one subject who would be sitting there. And the teacher would draw a 3-foot line, a 2-foot line, and a 1-foot line on the blackboard, and he would say, "All right, I want you to tell me which line is longest and which line is shortest." And the class would, one by one, as they go down through the members of the class, they would all say that the shortest line was the longest line, and that the longest line was the shortest line, and so on and so forth. And what they found out was that if there was one person in the class that disagreed with the majority, even if he said the middle line was the longest line and that the longest line was the shortest line, then the subject of the experiment would say that the longest line was the longest line and the shortest line was the shortest line. Otherwise, 80% of the time, once again, they would say whatever the rest of the class said. And not only that, they would defend it afterwards. they were convinced in their own minds that the class was right and that their own perceptions were wrong. So,
or they were afraid to speak out and say what they thought was obviously the case.
In some cases, yes. In some cases, though, they simply they hypnotically convinced themselves, evidently. Pavlov's dogs once all became unconditioned when the pipes broke in the laboratories, and it was very traumatic. All this water flooding the laboratory, and he had to condition the dogs all over again to get them to salivate when the bell rang and all that. So there are ways of deconditioning people, and this is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in finding some technique by which great masses of people can be broken out of their authoritarian conditioning all at once. Zen doesn't do that. Zen is a one-on-one thing. It's master-disciple. Psychotherapy doesn't do that. It's doctor-patient. It's one-on-one. The project, the uncompleted project of Zenarchy, and all Zenarchy, as far as I'm concerned, all writings that are Zenarchist writings, are notes toward that end, to figure out exactly what that type of enlightenment is, that type of liberation from authoritarian conditioning is, and how to achieve it on a wholesale basis.